A small, top-secret research facility located deep in a remote part of the world was home to some of the brightest minds in science. These researchers were involved in a project unlike any other, an experiment to capture and analyze the thoughts and consciousness of the dead. Their goal? To see if there was life after death and whether human consciousness could persist beyond the grave. The soldier chosen for this experiment had a mysterious past. His name was Captain Alex Morgan, and he had recently died under strange circumstances while serving in a classified military operation. The details of that operation were highly classified, and only a handful of people knew the full truth about it. Captain Morgan's death had left many questions unanswered, especially about the mission he was part of. The scientists believed his mind might hold crucial information that could change everything. They had developed an advanced camera system capable of monitoring the brain waves and any potential activity from the deceased's nervous system. But this was no ordinary camera. It was designed to capture not just the physical, but also the mental, and possibly even the spiritual state of a person after death. The experiment was risky, but the team believed it was their best shot at unlocking the mysteries of the human mind, and they knew they had to push the boundaries of science to achieve this. As they placed the camera inside Captain Morgan's coffin, there was an uneasy silence among the team. They had prepared for this moment for months, but now that the time had come, they couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. What if they had underestimated the consequences of this experiment? Would they discover something they were not ready to face? The countdown began. In just a few minutes, they would be able to view the footage for the first time. The team gathered around a large screen, each of them anxiously waiting to see what would happen next. As the camera clicked on, they watched in silence, knowing that they were about to witness something no one had ever seen before. The camera flickered to life, showing a blurry, faint image at first. Then slowly, the image began to sharpen. The team was staring at the inside of Captain Morgan's coffin. But something wasn't right. The coffin, which should have been still and lifeless, was subtly shifting as if disturbed by an invisible force. The air around it seemed to shimmer. The footage didn't show the dead soldier's body, at least not entirely. Instead, there was a strange energy around the coffin, something unexplainable. The camera picked up faint whispers, distant voices that seemed to be coming from within the coffin itself. At first, the scientists thought it was a malfunction, but they couldn't ignore the eerie feeling that something was truly happening. Then, just when they were about to speak up, the scene changed. Captain Morgan's face appeared on the screen, clear as day. But it wasn't a regular face. His eyes were wide open, staring into the camera with an expression of pure confusion and fear. His body was still, unmoving in the coffin. But it was as if his consciousness had somehow remained alive, aware of what was happening around him. The soldier's face twitched. Then a single word escaped his lips, spoken softly but with a terrifying urgency. "Help!" The researchers jumped back from the screen, shocked. The room fell into complete silence. This was not supposed to happen. Everyone was quiet, unsure whether what they were seeing was real or just an illusion. Was Captain Morgan still alive? Was he somehow aware of his own death? The scientists debated among themselves. Some were terrified, wanting to shut down the experiment immediately, while others were more curious, pushing to continue. They argued for what felt like hours, but despite their differences, they all agreed on one thing. They couldn't look away from the screen. They had to see what would happen next. The decision was made. The experiment would continue, though every instinct in the room screamed to stop. The team watched the screen, now more focused than ever as the footage began to shift once again. The face of Captain Morgan flickered, his expression slowly changing from fear to something far darker, something ancient. His eyes became wide, staring not just into the camera, but through it, as if seeing beyond the physical world. Suddenly, the camera captured a horrifying image. Around the edges of the coffin, the air rippled and the room's temperature seemed to drop. Shadows began to stretch and twist along the walls of the coffin, forming shapes that weren't quite human. The whispers turned into low, guttural murmurs, unintelligible but full of malice. The room where the coffin rested began to distort, warping like the scene was being viewed through a broken lens. Then, without warning, the images became chaotic. The footage started to jump rapidly, shifting between different places as if Captain Morgan's consciousness was being pulled through different dimensions. The soldier's face appeared on the screen again, but this time, he was no longer alone. Behind him, an ancient ghostly figure emerged, half human, half shadow, hovering just over his shoulder. The figure was silent, but its presence was enough to chill the air in the room. "What is that?" one of the scientists whispered, eyes wide in disbelief. The team could do nothing but watch in terror as the figure seemed to communicate with Captain Morgan. He didn't speak this time. Instead, the soldier's eyes darted back and forth as if he was in a trance. It was clear he was being manipulated by this presence, pulled deeper into the unseen world. The camera footage flickered violently, showing brief flashes of an unfamiliar battlefield, an endless war in a desolate, darkened land full of twisted, monstrous soldiers. This wasn't any war they had ever seen or heard of. The soldiers weren't human. They were like shadows, deformed and monstrous, as if born from the nightmares of the dead. Captain Morgan was among them, fighting, but it seemed like he wasn't in control of his actions. He was being forced to fight, as if trapped in a loop, caught between life and death, war and peace. One of the scientists stood up abruptly, trembling. This isn't just memory, this is something else. This isn't the afterlife. This is something worse." The camera continued to capture unsettling moments. Every few seconds, new images flashed across the screen. Flashes of fire, blood, and monstrous creatures crawling from the ground. It was a vision of war, but not any war of this world. The team couldn't understand how this was even possible. Was it all just a hallucination, a product of the dying brain? Or was Captain Morgan trapped in another world entirely? As the footage grew darker, the air in the lab became thick with tension. Each new image was more horrifying than the last. But the team couldn't stop watching. They were no longer just curious scientists. They had become witnesses to something far beyond their comprehension. Captain Morgan's face appeared once again, but this time his expression had changed. There was a look of desperation in his eyes. His mouth moved, but the words that came out were not what anyone expected. "The artifact that's waking up," he said, his voice distant and strained. "It must not be touched. They will come. You can't stop it." The room fell silent. Everyone stared at the screen in shock. What was he talking about? The soldier had been part of a covert military operation, but nothing about an artifact had ever been mentioned. The words didn't make sense. The team frantically searched their memories, trying to recall any piece of information they had about Captain Morgan's mission, but nothing clicked. Then, the footage shifted again, this time focusing on the darkened battlefield. Captain Morgan was fighting, but he wasn't fighting for his life. He was protecting something. In the distance, something glowed faintly. A strange object, half buried in the ground. It pulsed with an eerie light, and the closer Captain Morgan got to it, the more intense the shadows around him became. It was as if the very air was rejecting him. Something about the artifact was wrong, unnatural, and Captain Morgan was trying desperately to keep it from awakening. "What is that thing?" one of the researchers whispered, his voice shaky. A sudden realization hit one of the scientists. A memory of an old, classified document from years ago. It was about an ancient artifact discovered during a military mission. The document had been sealed and classified, but the description was vivid. The artifact was said to be from a time long before human civilization, and it had the power to open doors to other dimensions, a gateway between the living and the dead. It was believed to have been buried deep underground to prevent its power from being unleashed. Could this be the artifact? Was Captain Morgan's mission actually to protect it? The footage grew even more intense, and Captain Morgan's struggles escalated. He was surrounded by the monstrous creatures, shadows of soldiers twisted by the artifact's power, and they were closing in on him. His face twisted in agony, as if he were being torn between two worlds, the living and the dead. The researchers could hear his thoughts, or at least what the camera had captured. "I couldn't stop them. I couldn't protect it. It's too late." The camera began to glitch, the image shaking wildly as if something was trying to break free from the screen. Then, just as suddenly as the footage had started, it went black. The lab erupted into chaos. The scientists were frantic, trying to figure out what had just happened. Was it over? Had they lost the connection to Captain Morgan's mind? Or had something far worse been triggered? The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of quick breathing and nervous whispers. "I don't think it's over," one of the scientists said, his voice trembling. The screen remained black for what felt like an eternity. The team frantically worked to restore the connection, but nothing seemed to work. Panic started to set in. Had they truly lost the footage? Or worse, had they disturbed something that should have remained untouched? Just as they were about to give up, the screen flickered and the image slowly returned. But what they saw was beyond anything they had anticipated. Captain Morgan's face appeared again, but this time it wasn't trapped in the coffin. He was standing in a vast, desolate landscape surrounded by swirling, dark clouds. His eyes were wide with fear, and he looked directly into the camera, as if seeing the scientists for the first time. "There's no escape," he whispered, his voice shaky and distant. "They've found you. They'll find you. It's already started." Before the team could react, the footage began to shift violently. The camera moved rapidly, zooming in on the sky above. For a brief moment they saw a crack in the sky, a rip between dimensions. It was a jagged tear, glowing with an unnatural light, and through that tear something began to emerge. Monstrous figures, their eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. As the camera shook, the ground beneath Captain Morgan's feet cracked open, revealing the same glowing artifact he had tried so hard to protect. The soldiers in the strange battlefield were now converging on it, their twisted forms moving with terrifying speed. The team realized with growing horror that this wasn't just a military operation. It wasn't just an experiment. Captain Morgan's death had triggered something ancient and beyond their understanding. The artifact was a key, and the soldiers' consciousness had been tied to it. Now that link was unbreakable, and the consequences were unfolding before their very eyes. The camera zoomed out, revealing a vast war-torn landscape. The tear in the sky grew larger, and more shadowy figures began to pour through. The war wasn't just happening in another dimension. It was beginning to spill over into the real world. Suddenly, the footage cut to black again, and the lab fell into an eerie silence. But something had changed. The team looked around, and for the first time, they felt as if they weren't alone. A cold draft swept through the room, and the lights flickered. "It's happening," one of the scientists said, his voice trembling. "The tear, it's opening here." Outside the facility, strange disturbances were starting to occur. The sky was growing darker, and there were reports of unexplained phenomena happening all over the world. People were disappearing. Unexplainable creatures were being spotted in remote areas. It was as if the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. The scientists knew they had to act fast, but they didn't know how. They were no longer just studying the unknown. They had become a part of it. The world outside the facility was descending into chaos. What had started as strange disturbances, unexplained weather patterns, sudden power outages, and flickering lights, was now rapidly escalating into something far more sinister. Across the globe, people were witnessing terrifying phenomena. Animals behaving erratically, skyward rips in the clouds, and dark, shapeless figures moving across fields and streets. Entire cities were suddenly plunged into darkness, and a low hum could be heard in the air, vibrating through the ground. Inside the facility, the team was frantically trying to piece together what had gone wrong. The footage from Captain Morgan's coffin had revealed more than they ever anticipated. Something ancient, something powerful had been awakened. But they didn't know how to stop it. The crack in the sky was still there, growing wider with each passing minute. The monsters, shadows from another dimension, were pouring through the rift, and they were not content to simply stay on the other side. "We need to get to that artifact," one of the scientists said, his voice trembling with urgency. "It's the only way we can stop this before it spreads beyond our control." They had only a vague understanding of what the artifact was, but the footage had shown them enough. It was a gateway, a door between worlds, and Captain Morgan had been trying to keep it shut. His failure and his death had set everything in motion. The soldier's consciousness was still trapped between dimensions, tied to the artifact. And now his attempt to protect it had unleashed a nightmare on Earth. The team quickly gathered their equipment, preparing to leave the facility and head to the location where the artifact was buried. They had no time to waste. Every second counted. But as they moved to exit, The ground shook violently, and the facility's walls began to groan as though they were under a tremendous pressure. The hum in the air grew louder. Then, something crashed through the ceiling. A massive, shadowy figure, its shape only vaguely human, descended into the room. It was enormous, its form black as night, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. The team froze in terror, unable to move. This was no hallucination. This was real. The creature loomed over them, towering above, but it didn't attack. Instead, it seemed to be studying them, its eyes following every movement, every breath. The scientists backed away, instinctively reaching for their weapons, but they knew it was pointless. This thing wasn't from their world, and their technology had no power here. Then, the creature spoke, its voice like the sound of thousands of whispers, all layered together. "You have opened the door," it said. "You cannot close it now." The creature raised a hand, and suddenly, the walls of the facility warped and cracked. The tear in the sky was no longer a distant anomaly. It was right above them, a massive rift in reality itself. More shadowy figures began to pour through, their forms swirling and shifting like smoke. The team's worst fears were coming to life. "We need to leave," one of the scientists shouted, panic rising in his voice. "Now!" They turned to run, but the facility was collapsing around them. The air was thick with the energy of the rift, pulling at them, trying to drag them into the void. Outside, the world was in turmoil. The sky was torn open, and monstrous creatures were emerging from the cracks, terrorizing cities and towns. People were running in every direction, but it was clear they had no chance of escape. The world was no longer the place it once was. As the team fled, they realized something chilling. The artifact wasn't just a gateway to another world, it was a tool to bring that world to them. And there was no way to stop it now. The world outside was crumbling. As the team rushed through the facility's corridors, the reality of their situation began to sink in. The tear in the sky was growing larger by the minute, and more of the monstrous creatures were slipping through the rift. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the hum of the dimension-tearing energy was deafening. There was no escaping it. The creatures were everywhere now. As the scientists reached the surface, they saw the chaos outside. The streets were filled with people running in panic, but there was nowhere to run to. The sky was a swirling mess of dark clouds and strange, glowing lights. The rift had torn open the fabric of reality, and Earth was now caught between two worlds. The team quickly regrouped, knowing their only hope was to reach the artifact. It was their only chance to undo what had been set in motion, if such a thing was even possible. But as they neared the location, something terrifying happened. The ground beneath them shifted, and the air became heavy, thick with an unnatural energy. The rift in the sky above seemed to be pulling them closer. "We're too late," one of the scientists muttered, his voice defeated. "The world, it's already changing. We can't close the rift in time." They reached the site where the artifact had been buried, but what they saw there was beyond anything they could have imagined. The artifact wasn't buried anymore. It was floating above the ground, glowing with an intense light. Around it, the shadowy figures from the other dimension were gathered, circling it like vultures. The monsters were here, but they weren't just in the sky. They were on Earth, in the same space as the team. Captain Morgan's face appeared again on the screen of one of the portable devices they had brought with them. His expression was grim, exhausted, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes. He seemed to be aware of the scientist's presence, as if his consciousness was somehow still tethered to the artifact. "It's your choice now," Captain Morgan's voice echoed through the speakers. "You can't stop it, but you can. You can send it back. You'll need to use the artifact. But beware. It's a price you won't be able to pay." The team looked at each other, unsure what to do. The weight of their decision hung heavily in the air. If they used the artifact, they could potentially seal the rift and send the creatures back. But the cost would be great. Captain Morgan had warned them. The artifact demanded a sacrifice, a life, perhaps their lives. Could they truly make that choice? Was there any other way to stop the nightmare they had unleashed? The creatures began to move closer, their glowing eyes fixed on the scientists. Time was running out. They had to act. One of the scientists, trembling with fear but resolute, stepped forward. "We have no choice. We have to stop it." With that, they approached the glowing artifact. It pulsed with energy, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The shadowy figures began to close in, their forms becoming more solid, more menacing. The rift above them crackled with power. As the team activated the artifact, a burst of energy erupted from it. The rift above them widened further, pulling everything into it, humans, creatures, and all. For a brief moment, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. And then, silence. The tear in the sky collapsed, sealing itself shut. The monsters, the strange entities, the distortions of reality, they were all gone. The world was still. The sky was clear again, as though nothing had ever happened. But the scientists knew the truth. The price had been paid. The rift was sealed, but Captain Morgan, the soldiers, and the ancient forces that had awakened were gone. Their sacrifice had saved the world, but they had paid the ultimate price. The team stood in the quiet aftermath, knowing that the world would never be the same again. They had witnessed the impossible, and in doing so, they had learned one of life's greatest truths. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.